This mansion was not a dream. It was a mistake that took decades to collect its price. The problem was never building Hearst Castle. The problem was believing that someone could live inside something of that scale without paying an invisible cost. Because that hill in California did not hold only walls, corridors, and pool. It held a decision that could not be undone. Nothing there was made to end. Everything was made to keep growing. Always one more room, one more wing, one more collection. One more silent promise that stopping would mean admitting failure. And no one around William Randolph Hearst dared to say that word out loud. The castle was not created to be a home. It operated like an organism that demanded constant attention. Staff moved through routes guests never saw. Machines breathed beneath the ground. Kitchens worked like factories. Everything felt solid, as long as no one asked how much it cost to keep it running every single day. And almost no one asked. The threat was not in the walls, it was in the rhythm, because every week in San Simeon consumed more than many American families would see in a lifetime. Not just in money, but in time, energy, and control. The castle demanded presence. It demanded spectacle. It demanded that the empire keep spinning to feed it. And here is the question that changes everything. Who was really in charge there? The most powerful man in American media, or the house he never finished? For those who arrived as guests, everything seemed under control. Access was calculated. The experience was designed to impress. Every detail suggested absolute command. But behind that theater, there was a mechanism that could not be shut down without consequences. Because Hearst Castle was not planned for a specific moment. It was designed for an eternal after, always unfinished, always provisional, always promising an even larger version of itself. And that created a structural problem. There was no place to rest. Meanwhile, the outside world was beginning to change in dangerous ways. The rules that sustained Hearst's empire were not as solid as they seemed. The castle required a constant flow of power, influence, and money to justify its own existence. Without that flow, it would become something difficult to explain and impossible to sustain. The most unsettling detail is that, at first, everything worked perfectly. The system felt invincible. The castle attracted artists, politicians, movie stars. Isolation did not repel, it selected. Every guest reinforced the feeling that this place was the center of something greater. But a silent mistake was being made. A mistake that did not appear in photographs or glowing accounts. A mistake of scale. The larger the mansion, the smaller the margin for error. The more complex the structure, the less tolerance it has for the unexpected. And no one wanted to be the person who said, "This cannot last." The castle began to dictate the behavior of the man who built it. Trips were planned around it. Relationships orbited it. Strategic decisions of the media empire passed, directly or indirectly, through that isolated hill. The house stopped being a symbol. It became a center of gravity. But centers of gravity have a problem. Everything starts to fall toward them. And while the castle grew, something else began to contract. Time, public tolerance, the patience of the systems that sustained that level of excess. What looked like absolute control was, in reality, a dangerous dependence. Here is the detail almost no one noticed at the time. Hearst Castle was not built to survive decline. It only worked in expansion. And when expansion slows, the bill arrived. The question that remains is not how this castle was built. The real question is, what happens when the power that feeds a mansion begins to disappear, and the house keeps demanding everything? The first crack did not appear in the stone. It appeared in the system. Hearst Castle only worked as long as William Randolph Hearst remained at the absolute center of gravity. Not symbolically, logistically. Decisions flowed outward from him like power lines. Money followed attention. Attention followed spectacle. And spectacle followed the house. As long as Hearst moved, the machine obeyed. But the castle was not passive. It demanded presence, long stays, endless hosting, a constant rotation of guests who reinforced its meaning. Senators, generals, Hollywood stars, foreign dignitaries. Each visit justified the expense. Each weekend turned isolation into exclusivity. The house only made sense when it was full. The problem was that Hearst could not be everywhere forever. Every day the castle consumed more than it produced. Not just food, fuel, and wages, but authority. Decisions that once governed a national media empire were increasingly delayed, delegated, or avoided because the center was no longer mobile. The empire bent around the house, and systems that bend too long eventually deform. Hearst had built his power on speed, newspapers reacting before competitors, headlines shaping opinion overnight, pressure applied instantly, relentlessly. But San Simeon was slow, physically distant, logistically isolated. Even communication lagged. What felt like control from the terraces often meant delay everywhere else. At first, the delays were invisible. Editors waited, executives compensated. The brand was strong enough to absorb friction, but the cost was cumulative. While Hearst curated dinner conversations on the Hill, rivals adapted faster. New media formats emerged, audiences shifted. The world outside the castle did not slow down to match its rhythm, and no one wanted to tell him. Inside the castle, agreement was safer than truth. Guests praised, staff complied, architects kept building. The house rewarded loyalty and punished friction. Questioning the pace meant questioning the man. And questioning the man meant risking exile from one of the most powerful circles in America. So the warning signs were reframed as inconvenience. Expenses were investment. Delays were temporary. Expansion was vision. Every problem was solved by adding another wing, another party, another proof of relevance. But that solution only worked while the money kept moving. The moment the broader economy tightened, the castle's logic began to unravel. Hearst Castle was designed for abundance, not resilience. Its scale left no room for contraction. You could not partially run it. You could not quietly slow it down. Either the system functioned at full capacity, or it exposed its own absurdity. And Hearst felt this pressure more acutely than anyone. Publicly, he remained dominant. Privately, his world narrowed. Travel became less frequent. Time at San Simeon increased. The house that was meant to display power began to replace it. Guests still arrived, but fewer. The conversations repeated. The walls absorbed routines instead of momentum. Isolation does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates. The castle sat above the Pacific, like a command post, detached from the battlefield it was meant to control. Hearst still owned newspapers. He still influenced politics. But the feedback loop weakened. Decisions traveled down the hill slower than the world demanded. And then the structure that had fed everything began to turn inward. Hearst Castle was no longer amplifying his empire. It was sheltering him from its decline. That is the moment when a symbol of power becomes a liability. Not because it collapses, but because it keeps working exactly as designed, while the world it was built for disappears. And the most dangerous question began to surface, quietly, impossibly late. What happens when the house outlives the system that justified it? By the time the collapse became visible, Hearst Castle had already won. Not in triumph, in permanence. The house no longer needed to justify itself. It existed, and that existence forced everything else to adapt around it. What had once been a tool of influence had hardened into an immovable fact. Editors adjusted schedule, executives filtered information, decisions were softened before they ever reached the hill. This was not loyalty, it was risk management. The man who once thrived on confrontation now lived inside a structure designed to remove. The castle absorbed conflict the way its walls absorbed sound. Thick stone, long corridors, distance by design. Disagreement arrived tired, if it arrived at all. And the outside world sensed it. Political allies grew cautious. Hollywood shifted attention to newer power brokers. Media competitors learned they could move faster simply by not waiting. The empire did not collapse in flames. It thinned. Influence leaked instead of shattering. Inside Hearst Castle, life continued as if nothing fundamental had changed. Meals were served with precision. Guests followed rituals refined over years. The routines were flawless, and that was the danger. Systems that feel stable often hide the fact that they are no longer relevant. Hearst spent more time seated, more time observing than directing. The castle made this feel natural. Everything came to him: staff, information, entertainment. There was no friction to signal decline, only quiet. Power rarely announces when it leaves, it just stops responding. The house became quieter, but not emptier. Fewer guests arrived, yet stays grew longer. Conversations circled familiar ground. The same arguments, the same stories, the same reassurances. The castle preserved the past in real time, replaying relevance long after it had faded elsewhere. And the cost continued, not as a dramatic expense, but as a constant drain. Maintaining Hearst Castle required a workforce that never slept, systems that never paused, and resources that never shrank. The house could not age gracefully. It demanded to remain monumental every single day. Hearst understood this, even if he never admitted it aloud. He reduced travel not out of comfort, but necessity. The world outside moved too fast. The house moved too slowly, and adjusting the house was impossible. So he adapted instead. Isolation, once a privilege, became routine. Distance became habit, and habit hardened into dependence. The castle no longer symbolized power. It defined the limits of it. This is the quiet inversion that ends empires, not rebellion, not scandal, but enclosure. By the time the public noticed Hearst's withdrawal, it felt natural. Age explained it. Health excused it. The narrative softened what was actually happening. The system had reversed. The man no longer controlled the structure. The structure controlled the man. And when power becomes static, it begins to fossilize. Hearst Castle did not decay physically. It remained immaculate. But functionally, it had become something else entirely. Not a headquarters, not a statement. A monument to a version of influence that could no longer operate in the present tense. The question was no longer whether the empire could be saved. The question was simpler and far more uncomfortable. What happens to a mansion built for absolute power? When absolute power no longer needs it? The final transformation did not come with bankruptcy papers or public disgrace. It came with silence. Hearst Castle survived the decline because survival was never the problem. Meaning was. As William Randolph Hearst aged, the world learned how to function without his constant intervention. Newspapers continued printing. Studios kept producing. Politics moved on to louder, faster figures. The empire did not vanish. It decentralized. And decentralization is lethal to places built to concentrate power. The castle remained immaculate, increasingly unnecessary. Hearst's physical world shrank to match the architecture around him. Long walks became rare. Public appearances stopped altogether. The man who once shaped national opinion now consumed it from a distance. Reading about events he no longer steered. Information arrived filtered, delayed, softened. The house was doing its job too well. Everything uncomfortable was absorbed before reaching him. Every conflict was managed by someone else. The castle insulated its creator from the very feedback that once made him dangerous. What remained was routine without consequence. This is how isolation masquerades as stability. Guests still came, but not because they needed Hearst. They came because the castle was already there, a relic worth witnessing. The power dynamic inverted. Visitors were no longer orbiting influence. They were touring history while it was still breathing, and Hearst sensed this, even if he never articulated it. The castle that once symbolized ambition had become a boundary. Leaving it felt risky. Staying felt safe. Safety, for a man whose entire life had been built on confrontation, was not a victory. It was a concession. The most brutal irony was structural. Hearst Castle outperformed its owner. It aged better. It adapted better. It would last longer. As Hearst's health declined, decisions were deferred indefinitely. Projects halted mid-idea. The castle, famously unfinished, became a metaphor rather than a work site. Construction stopped not because the vision was complete, but because there was no longer urgency behind it. An unfinished empire is still an empire. An unfinished mansion becomes a question. When Hearst died, there was no dramatic reckoning, no sudden collapse. The house did not empty overnight. Staff continued routine. Rooms remained staged. The system had learned to operate without its origin point, and that was the final cost. Hearst Castle did what no rival ever managed to do. It removed Hearst from the center of his own story. After his death, The transition was inevitable. The mansion shifted from private power structure to public artifact, from command center to museum, from leverage to legacy. The house that once demanded absolute control now accepted visitors with tickets. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. The empire needed motion. The castle demanded permanence, and permanence always wins. The house still stands on the hill. The name is remembered. The rooms are preserved, but the system that required such a structure no longer exists. The power that justified it dissolved quietly, leaving behind walls that no longer point outward, only backward. Which leaves one final question, the one Hearst Castle never answered. Was the mansion meant to serve the empire, or was the empire always just fuel for the mansion? What followed was not collapse, but reinterpretation. After Hearst was gone, Hearst Castle entered a phase that no architect had planned for. It no longer needed to impress power, because power was no longer present. It needed to explain itself, and that is a very different function. The mansion had been built to operate in private time. Decisions could stretch, cost could hide, excess could be justified by influence. Once that private time ended, the house was forced into public time. Schedules, tickets, maintenance budgets, narratives. Everything that had once been invisible became measurable, and measurement is unforgiving. The castle did not suddenly become cheaper. Its scale never changed. The same terraces needed care. The same roofs demanded repair. The same pools required water, cleaning, staff. What changed was the logic behind paying for it. There was no longer an empire generating justification by default. Now the house had to justify itself directly, so it became something else. Rooms that once hosted private conversations about elections and studios were reorganized into exhibits. Furniture stopped being used and started being preserved. Corridors designed to separate staff from guests were now explained to visitors as behind-the-scenes marvel. What had once been functional secrecy became educational spectacle. The system adapted, but only by freezing. Hearst Castle survived because it surrendered movement. It accepted that it would never again be a place where decisions mattered in real time. Instead, it would become a place where decisions were remembered. That trade saved the building and ended the role it was built for. And this transition exposed the true cost of the mansion. Not financial, interpretive. Once the castle was no longer an instrument of power, it became evidence of it. Every room turned into a question. Why this scale? Why this isolation? Why this insistence on permanence? Guides could describe the art, the pools, the architecture, but none of that explained the emotional logic behind building something that could only function under absolute control. Visitors felt it even if they couldn't name it. Hearst Castle is not intimidating. It is disorienting. Its rooms do not flow like a home. They assert, they accumulate, they overwhelm without offering comfort. That made sense when the house was an extension of a man who needed to dominate space. It feels strange when stripped of that purpose, and that strangeness is the legacy. The mansion outlived the empire, but it did not outgrow it. Every preserved surface still reflects a system that no longer exists, a time when power could afford to be centralized, when delay did not equal irrelevance, when isolation signaled control instead of withdrawal. That world ended quietly, and the castle was left behind as proof it ever existed. Today, Hearst Castle stands immaculate, stable, admired, but it does not project the future. It archives a mistake, the belief that power could be made permanent if built large enough, remote enough, expensive enough. The final irony is structural and unavoidable. The house survived because it stopped trying to matter. It no longer competes. It no longer commands. It no longer demands attention from the present. It asks only that people look backward. That is the only way a structure of that scale can coexist with a world that moves faster than stone. Hearst Castle did not fail. It succeeded past the point of usefulness. The empire needed adaptability. The mansion needed permanence. When those needs diverge, only one could remain. The house is still there. The system is not. And that is the quiet lesson buried beneath the terraces and towers. Power that cannot shrink eventually becomes architecture.